term black swan came into our knowledge bank very early in my tenure. But what I noticed and what had happened is, as I navigated Dow through change, that these disruptions kept going on all the time. They were intensifying. And the term new normal, in my words and in the book, I set the stage for the new abnormal. The new abnormal is these tectonic fissures that are appearing now on a constant basis, the collision of geopolitical fissures, digital ones, environment, social and governance ones. These fissures are being amplified and made worse by the new paradigm of connectivity, the new paradigm of that absolutely, totally everything's short-term, and that we're suffering from a disease called short-termism, whether it be financial owners of a corporation, whether it be politicians. The new paradigm is that the institutions that were put in place post-World War II versus the institutions we need for the 21st century, the ones in the 20th century are failing us. United Nations, WHO, WTO. So I noticed this new paradigm and new reality of a leadership vacuum. And I started to ask the question, why, and what did I do about it when all these crises came? And to your point about disruption, I do consider myself a disruptor, but I consider myself a disruptor in the strategic context. Lou Gerstner disrupted IBM, fixed IBM. I'm on the board there, as said in the bio. But when he came and talked to my management team, we asked him, what was your greatest fear? He said, when we started making money again. And I think this inbred complacency that happens to institutions and the paradigm of looking backwards to fix the forward problem is fine in some sort of steady state. But we're nowhere near a steady state. We are in a completely volatile, constantly changing, amplified by digital environment, overcome by short-termism. So in the book, I lay out the case for why we actually have to change the way we lead. In the academy I started, that's what our students are being taught. The book I wrote with a lot of narrative about my own experiences to bring it to life. So in the middle, I go through a lot of lessons, which we can get into here in a minute, and really try to address the way one can solve against these new realities and really set the stage for the new context. And at the end, I end up with optimism on how I think some of the solution space will play out in 2050 or 2040 or some time frame, not now. That where does this all go is within our control. We just have to change how we lead. And so what I really lay out is what that leadership model can be. And looking around one corner, looking around two corners, having scenario planning, plan A, plan B, plan C. These are the sorts of things I address in the book in terms of practical things. I'll end the opening question by saying that the role of business looms large as a thread through my book. And what I worried about a little bit about the timing of the release of the book is 2 or 3 years ago, ESG became something that everyone was writing about. And 2 or 3 years later, as in now, people in the political class have overcome it and talk about it as wokeism. And I think that's a complete and utter fallacy. And purpose-based profits and how one gets there is the responsibility of accountable business that stands tall in figuring out the rule book for the 21st century. So I put a business call to action in the book that in particular enterprises, but not just enterprises, they should lead in redefining the rule book and the playbook for the 21st century.
So I want to unpack a lot of what you just said there, but let's focus in on something here. You talk about this very rapid sequence of, let's call them black swan events or fat tail events. And so they're happening with much greater frequency than would have normally been anticipated. And therefore they also have a sort of unpredictable compounding effect on each other as well. So the subtitle of your book is A Changemaker's Guide to 21st Century Leadership, right? So let's focus on that here, because you talk about all of the change that's gone on in the world. I assume that also means then that leadership and the structure around leadership needs to change as well. You just brought up the iconic CEO, Lou Gerstner from IBM. You quote him in the book at one point where he talks about transformation of an enterprise, quote, begins with a sense of crisis or emergency. No institution will go through fundamental change unless it believes it is in deep trouble and needs to do something different to survive. So if that's sort of the prevailing ethos of the moment here, in a sense, what is the hallmark then of the leader of a Fortune 100 type company today, and how they structure the C-suite around them?
Thank you. Yeah, and I quote Lou, and I also mentioned that when I first became CEO, I was encouraged to go benchmark successful, either current or just retired CEOs like Lou. And there were quite a few others that I went and talked to, some notables, successful from the 80s and 90s, like a Jack Welch and a Larry Bossidy and A.G. Lafley and quite a few other names like that. And the playbook that I got from them, I put in place to execute in my first year or two or three. But what was becoming very apparent, and 9/11 happened around then, was there were a lot of tectonic shifts going on around me that made strategy in the traditional model of last century almost moot. And some of the more recent terms like Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3 strategies, famously out of McKinsey, you don't ever get to Horizon 3 if Horizon 1 upends you. And then this notion of creating a crisis became, Clay Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma. How do I absolutely, totally put my organization on edge? Now, I also say in the book that one of my lessons was that I had to reinvent myself as a CEO 6 times that I could count during my almost 15 years tenure. In that first year or two, I didn't realize I had to do that to myself, that actually totally I am the leader and the tone setter for the entire organization. So I made a mistake or two, notably, and I talk about a boardroom coup in the book, which is a juicy part of the book that you should definitely try and pick up on. What I miscalculated was I was changing the company, but the people around me were resistors to that change, but not obvious to me. And so really one of the things that I say about disruption is, so if you're going to disrupt, which in my view in this book, I say it's no longer a choice, you're going to be disrupted. So be the disruptor, be the best disruptor. And I talk about it, we can unpack this in a board context, and I talk about it in a leadership context. And what I actually totally found out is that I had to change the organization around me. I had to flatten it. I had to be ubiquitous as the change maker. I was in 40 countries a year. I had to go to the troops. I had to be the field general, and I had to be in the trenches with the troops. I had to communicate directly with them. And eventually the people around me, the headquarters people, had to change. That was one of the hardest things to do. And changing the middle of a large organization is almost impossible to do. It's a mindset shift, and it's every person has to have the mindset shift because it's one person at a time. Culture eats strategy for lunch. I've heard that term, and I totally agree with it. So the 200 jobs that were around me at the time I became CEO, the 200 jobs that were when I retired 15 years later, only 4 people made the journey. So it's an example of one of the biggest lessons one could learn is run at the pace of the organization around you. If the organization doesn't run at the pace of transformation, select in people who can and bring in the people who have the energy, the passion, and the belief system to undertake that change. Very much endemic throughout the book is I have 12 leadership lessons in there. I won't, because of sake of time, take us through every single one of them. But changing yourself as time demands was a big one. And then changing the team around you to run the race that you have to race was another big one. And then disrupt yourself and create the internal crisis if the external one doesn't exist, which, by the way, I don't think is a problem because the external one is now always existing.